Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Covert, your biology teacher, and I wanted to give you a presentation on evolution. Specifically, I wanted to talk about the evidence for evolution and the mechanisms of evolution. But before we can do any of that, I want to talk about Darwin and his finches. So here we go. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and he passed away in 1882. And he was an English naturalist, and he wrote The Origin of Species, which is this book right here. It was highly controversial during his life, and he wrote this after his voyage on the HMS Beagle. HMS Beagle, HMS stands for Her Majesty's Ship, and that's Charles Darwin right there. And he took this voyage on the HMS Beagle for 5 years, and he went all over the world. So you can kind of look at his route there. And it started and ended in England at this point right here. And he looked at the flora and fauna, plants and animals. So flora are plants, fauna are animals, and that he looked at those along the coasts of the land masses that he traveled. And he wrote down his observations. And so there's some interesting things that I'm going to go over about that. And most notable of his observations were between South America and the Galapagos Islands. Here we go. So when we look at a map here, this is South America, and so we have Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and what Darwin noticed, so as he's traveling along the coast here, he noticed that the beaks of the finches had different qualities about them. So they might have been pointy or round, and he's noticing also when he got to the Galapagos Islands that the beaks are completely different in the Galapagos Islands than they were in Ecuador. And he also noticed that between the different islands, that the beaks were actually very different from one another. And he came up with this idea that these finches have adapted to their environment so they could better survive. So they developed these specialized beaks so that they could eat certain foods. Kinda neat. And he called that term adaptation. So here's some examples of the finches from his book, and these are drawings from his book. You can kind of see that the beaks are quite different from one another. So now that you have a little bit of background around kind of how evolution came to be, we're going to talk about the evidence for evolution. So what's the scientific evidence that supports evolution? Here we go. First one is fossils, and this one's a little weird, but I'm using it as an example just because it's I love it. So this is an example of an organism that was known by scientists as Archaeopteryx, and Archaeopteryx scientists kind of drew this picture, and this is what they thought it might look like based on the fossil here, and it's kind of like this Velociraptor bird hybrid, and it's no coincidence that it looks like a velociraptor lizard bird hybrid, because this is actually cataloging in this time period that Archaeopteryx was like a transition organism between reptiles and birds. So it's showing kind of the evolutionary history that birds evolved from reptiles. And so that's some evidence that you can see right there. That's just one type of evidence, fossils. Another type of evidence is anatomy. And these are radial bones. So they're in your arm, you have a radius and ulna, and so this one's the radius. And cats, whales, and bats have this analogous structure. So it has a similar function, but they are organisms that are not necessarily directly related to one another. And so we call that an analogous structure. And there's also these things called pharyngeal gill slits. And so in fish, we know that gills are used to basically take oxygen from the water and use the oxygen, because fish do breathe oxygen. They just breathe it differently than we do. They use gills. And at one point in our development, we actually have gill slits. So they're called pharyngeal gill slits, and that actually becomes our inner ear later. So quite interesting. Molecular biology is another piece of evidence that evolution is a thing because we can actually look at human DNA, and we can compare it to chimp DNA, and we notice that there's actually a lot of the letters are the same. So DNA sequences, geneticists can actually basically take gene sequences and they can actually match and see how many letters are the same in our DNA. And the numbers show that we're actually about 99% similar. Depending on the data source, you look at 98, 99. We're very, very similar genetically to chimpanzees. The other one that was recently discovered that we're very, very closely related to, about the same percentage, is bonobos. So bonobos are related to us as well, and they're another type of monkey. This is a bonobo, and this is a chimp. Biogeography is another piece of evidence for evolution. So there's this little guy called Didelphis virginiana, and you've probably heard of this organism. This is actually the Virginia opossum, and we have quite a few of them around here. Where you live right now, so in Massachusetts, where I live in Massachusetts. And so basically, we don't have any marsupials except for this guy. So there's only one species of marsupial in Massachusetts, and actually the whole entire United States. There's no marsupials except for this guy. Why is that? Well, biogeography can actually look at the relationship between organisms and basically historical data, and we can actually figure out what happened to the marsupials and why did they all die off. And what we've actually found was that there's a hot pocket of marsupials in Australia. So along the coast here of Australia, there's a ton of marsupials. So they've adapted and survived in this area for many, many years. And we only have one species. South America has the next highest, and there's none over here. So interesting. About 3 million years ago, when there's a landmass that actually formed between South America and North America, and it's actually the Panama Canal, what we call it today. And marsupials just kind of walked across 3 million years ago, and the only one that's survived at this point was Didelphis virginiana, or the Virginia opossum. So biogeography can tell us events that happened in the past and how they might have contributed to populations evolving. We can also look at direct observation of different populations. And one of the things that we look at is the flu virus. It's actually coronavirus, but flu virus, actually the protein coat on the flu virus changes from year to year. And so it evolves. And so we can actually directly observe that. And so we have to constantly update, make new vaccines against the flu so that we can stay healthy. So now we're going to talk a little bit about mechanisms of evolution. And so how does it happen? Well, there's a couple different ways that this happens: selection, migration, genetic drift, and mutation. And the important thing to know about evolution is that evolution only happens within populations. So it doesn't happen in individual organisms. And it creates genetic variation, which changes our allele frequency and pushes evolution forward. So these are the different routes that can happen to cause evolution. First way that evolution, or the first mechanism that can cause evolution, is mutation. So, and these are random, and they're just single point mutations. So it's just one letter in your gene sequence can change, and then you can pass that gene on, and it creates different traits. So that's mutation is a mechanism. There's selection. So selection is all it is that a certain trait is preferred in a population, and it gives you some kind of advantage. So there's this moth. It's called the peppered moth, and so this is actually an example of disruptive selection. So camouflage is an example of disruptive selection, and these darker colored moths are they're living the life. Like they're not going to be eaten by predators. They kind of blend in. This one here, especially, is going to blend in. This one, I don't know, maybe not so lucky. This moth, no matter kind of where they are, they might not blend in too well, and they're probably going to get eaten by a bird. So basically what happens is these moths are going to survive. They're going to reproduce and produce more offspring that probably have those traits that make them more likely to survive. There's also in peacocks or peafowl birds of these guys are actually from Asia, and there are different coloration patterns that make birds more attractive, male birds especially. So in peacocks, the male birds have these giant tail feathers and super awesome colors, and whoever has the biggest tail feathers and most colorful feathers, then they are more likely to um, get mated with. And there's actually a study done to prove that sexual selection was a thing back in the 90s. And they, the scientists glued, scientists are so weird, they glued feathers, tail feathers to parakeets. And basically, they glued them to male parakeets. And they gave them extensions, essentially. And what they found out was the male parakeets that had um, really long tail feathers were actually selected to be mates. So the females found that more attractive, and even though they actually didn't have longer tail feathers, and so it's quite interesting. And what that basically does, selection, especially sexual selection, is basically when an organism is more attracted or more attractive, biologically, it's a mechanism that says, "Oh, that person is going to produce babies that can survive more readily." So organisms will want to mate with organisms that have characteristics that show that they are fit to reproduce. Um, Gene flow. So gene flow is also known as migration. And the mechanism of evolution goes a little like this. So a neighboring population has all these diverse traits, and then a few of them go and they're like, you know what, I don't want to stay in this population anymore. I'm going to go travel over here across the hill to this other population, and they breed and they produce offspring that have very different traits now. So you basically have genes from one population flow into another population and creating variation and potentially new traits. That's migration. And the last one is genetic drift. So genetic drift is a mechanism of evolution that a chance event happens. So I like this example. Let's call these ladybugs. And so in this one, this is a population of ladybugs that there's a 5-to-5 ratio. So 5 of these are red and 5 of them are blue. So now there's a chance event that happens. So it's ladybug season. You take a fly swatter and you randomly whack this population, and you're basically there's a lot of blue underneath that fly swatter, and so now the ratio is 10-to-2. So we only have 2 of these blue ones. So you're going to see that there's not going to be a whole lot of blue in the offspring because uh, there's less organisms that have that characteristic now. So when they reproduce, you're not going to have too many blue because there's only one blue, and then they go and reproduce, and now there's 10 red ones and 2 blue ones. So that's genetic drift, where the alleles or the traits in a population will actually change due to a chance event. I hope this was helpful. This was a lot of fun for me to make, and if you have questions, please contact me. I am happy to help you understand this, whatever you need, but enjoy.